All right. Well, there are moments and experiences in life that shape us and change us, aren't there? And a lot of times we call these moments defining moments, right? It's a defining moment in my life. And the reality is that everyone that makes an impact in any way, there is a defining moment that they can point to where everything changed. And a couple months ago we were talking about the men's hockey team from the 1980 Olympics, and we were talking about how they went against the Soviets and everything like that. And I want to talk a little bit more about them this morning because they overcame impossible odds. And their story, it's kind of retold in the movie Miracle. And that team back then in the Olympics, they were, the events were participated in by amateurs. So the men's hockey team was made up of a bunch of college players. And their coach, Herb Brooks, as he put the team together, Herb Brooks would get to know the players, and he wanted them to get to know each other. So he'd ask them once in a while, he'd ask somebody their name, and they'd say their name, and then he'd say, well, where are you from? And they'd say where they were from, and then he says, and who do you play for? And they would always just say what college team they would play for, and the various colleges represented and everything like that. And as you're watching the movie, you didn't think too much of that. But as time went on and as it got closer to the Olympics, the team began getting better, and they were getting actually pretty good, but there was something that was still missing. And it kind of came to a head when they played an exhibition game against Norway, and it was a tie. And Norway was a much more inferior team than the United States, so it should have never been tie, but yet USA ties Norway. And after the game's over, the USA team begins to skate off the ice towards the locker room, and Herb Brooks stops them. And he says, wait a minute. And he goes, what are you doing? And he goes, get on the line. And they all lined up on the line. And every time they would blow the whistle, they'd have to do skate sprints down the ice and then back again. And he'd have them do it over and over and over again. And the players are getting tired. They just played a game. And the people that are leaving the arena are watching, saying what's going on. And eventually, they're doing it so long that the ice rink manager says, I can't stay. And he turns off the lights. And the players think, well, we're done. But he's not. He keeps blowing the whistle. And they keep having to go over and over. And they're exhausted. They're falling down, exhausted, to the point where even some of the other coaches are looking at Herb Brooks saying, what are you doing? But then this happened. And I want you to see what happens from the movie Miracle.
Again. Again. Herb. Come on, Craig, blow the whistle. Again.
Michael Ruzioni! We're through Massachusetts!
Who do you play for?
I play for the United States of America!
That's all, gentlemen.
All right. You see, the team, they had decent enough talent. But you know what? They needed an attitude adjustment. Actually, they needed to realize that they were playing for something far bigger than just themselves. Here, I'm playing for the United States of America. That's who I represent. And then after this moment, after this defining moment, everything changed. And they go on to glory. They beat this Soviet team and then go on to eventually win the gold medal. But you know what it shows us? Attitude means everything. As followers of Jesus, just like we see here with Team USA, it's a game changer to understand that. And this is why last week we began looking at some attitudes that make all the difference in our world as followers of Jesus. These attitudes, they drive us, they shape us in the way we live lives of impact for Jesus right where we are. Especially as we face this new year, right? And last week, we highlighted the first game-changing attitude that we can have as we enter the new year. It's unshakable faith, as we looked at the life of a man named Caleb. And today, we can kind of continue looking at attitudes, and we discover our second attitude in a man named Isaiah. And his story really comes to a head in Isaiah chapter 6. So if you have your Bibles, you can open up to Isaiah chapter 6. And Isaiah, he was a prophet of God. And as a prophet of God, prophets of God, they were basically messengers sent by God, right, to deliver God's word. And it was often a message of judgment, a message of repentance, and a message of promise to God's people. And in Isaiah's case, into God's people, the nation of Judah, right? And in our passage this morning, we discover Isaiah's attitude in answering the call to share God's message with his world. In fact, his attitude is seen, it comes to fruition in verse 8 of chapter 6. In fact, let's look at that this morning. It's real quickly. Isaiah's recounting himself here, and he says, "And I heard the voice of the Lord saying, 'Whom shall I send? Who will go for us?' Then I said, 'Here am I. Send me.'" Isn't that awesome? It's kind of heroic. You know, who's going to step up to the plate? And Isaiah says, "Here am I. Send me." And this doesn't look like really too much, really all that unique or anything, until we kind of realize exactly what Isaiah is saying here in telling God to send him. You see, it's what he says, and it's also what he doesn't say here. You see, Isaiah doesn't respond to God's call here by saying, "Hey, God, I'm here. I am here." And he doesn't say, "Hey, God, here I am." Rather, look at the words that Isaiah uses here. He says, "Here am I." Now, you may be hearing this, and you may be thinking to yourself, "I don't get it. There's not much of a difference here, is there?" I mean, they all kind of say the same thing, don't they? No, they don't. See, the wording here is very important. And here's why. You see, if God calls me and I tell God, "Hey, I'm here. I'm here." The emphasis that is more on my answer is more about my location, right? It's saying, "I'm right here, God." So this can, in essence, be saying to God, "Yeah, God, I'll serve you right where I am. Right where I'm comfortable. I mean, I'll do whatever you ask. I'll do whatever you ask me to do right here. But you know, God, just don't send me like to Antarctica or any place like that. I mean, I'm here for you." You know, this was the kind of attitude that another one of God's messengers, another prophet named Jonah, remember when we looked at Jonah? This was kind of the attitude he had. He said, "I'll serve you here, where I'm comfortable." And where did that get him? It got him in the belly of a fish, didn't it? So Isaiah, he didn't say, "I'm here." He also didn't say, "Here I am." You see, the emphasis in this kind of answer is on the am part, on his being, on what he has to offer. So if we answer to God, "Yeah, God, here I am," it's, "God, here's what I have to offer. I'll serve you with what I have, with what I bring to the table. God, I'll serve you in the areas that I have talent or gifts, of what I do well." Basically, we're saying, I don't want to necessarily serve outside my comfort zone where we might not be as capable. Because we want to be successful, right? So we want to be where we're most capable, most gifted to do it. So we say to God, "Yeah, I'll serve you with what I have to offer you, as long as it's in there." But I can't do that, so don't ask me to do that. And again, that puts limits on how we're going to serve. But rather, how does Isaiah answer? He says, here am I. Here the emphasis is on the I, right? On the fullness of who he is. He says, on who I am, it's for you. God, you have all of me. Do as you please. I'll do whatever you want, wherever you want, however you want me to do it. You see, this kind of answer, it offers more than just location, more than just abilities. Here Isaiah is just offering himself. For God to do with him as he chooses. So he's saying, I might not be good at things, but God, I'll put myself out there and you'll make me good at this. God, I don't necessarily want to go everywhere for you, but if you want me to go there, then I'll do wherever. Because I know it's you leading me. And in this kind of answer, in this attitude that answers, here am I, we find this second difference-making attitude that's going to transform our impact going into this new year and beyond. And the attitude is this: selfless servanthood. This attitude of selfless servanthood will make an impact on our world, wherever we go, wherever God leads us to. And driven by this attitude, we see that Isaiah, he not only boldly shared God's message, and it was a message of judgment to his people, his world, the people of Judah, but he also brought a message of restoration and redemption through all of his prophecies about Jesus that were fulfilled long after his life ended. In fact, Isaiah, more than any Old Testament writer, tells about Jesus and the glory of Jesus. And he did this as God led him through selfless servanthood. Now, Isaiah, he didn't always have this kind of attitude. As a matter of fact, there's 5 chapters before this in the book of Isaiah. He didn't have this attitude of selfless servanthood always. Rather, it was crafted in him. It was built in him by God through a moment that shaped his life and his service. In fact, I want to take a look at his defining moment this morning, and it happens right before he reveals this new attitude that he has. Right before this, in the beginning of chapter 6. And I want to look at this so that we can discover that we can as well share in this attitude as we follow Jesus today. So let's go back. We'll start looking at the beginning of the chapter because this is when this defining moment starts for Isaiah. It starts in verse 1. It says, "In the year that King Uzziah died, I saw the Lord sitting upon a throne, high and lifted up, and the train of his robe filled the temple." So here he's kind of giving the setting to what happens. Okay, it takes place in the year that King Uzziah, who's the king of Judah, the year that he died. Now we know the year that King Uzziah died. It was 739 BC, so it kind of sets that. Now King Uzziah was king of Judah. He reigned for 52 years. And Chronicles talks about King Uzziah. He says, King Uzziah, he was a good king. In fact, he did what was right in the eyes of the Lord, which was rare for the kings of this time. Yet, toward the end of Uzziah's life, he started to stray a little bit from God. In fact, his pride one day led him to enter the temple, the place only the priests could go. But Uzziah thought, well, I'm pretty good too, so I'm going to go in. And when he did that, God struck him with leprosy, making him ceremonially unclean from that moment on. And Uzziah paid the price. And the people during Uzziah's reign, you would think, well, they were doing pretty good too, but not really, because the people at that time, they strayed from God pretty badly. In fact, to the point where God says, I'm going to send my judgment. And a lot of what Isaiah is talking about leading up to this point is about God sending the Assyrians in to lay ruin to Judah because of their sin. But despite this, Judah still prospered under Uzziah's reign. In fact, they were as powerful and as wealthy as they were under the reigns of King David and Solomon. I mean, he restored this glory to the kingdom, earthly glory to the kingdom of Judah. So, in this year that King Uzziah dies, it was a huge loss for the people. And Isaiah himself would be downcast at this because they lost a great leader. And it's at this point that he has a vision. And he sees the Lord, it says, right? The year that King Uzziah died, I saw the Lord. Now, who is he talking about with seeing the Lord? What specifically is he talking about? Well, what's interesting here is that many scholars today think that in seeing the Lord, he's saying he saw Jesus, a picture of Jesus sitting on the throne. Now, where do we get this from? Well, we get this actually from John's gospel, because later on in John's gospel, when he's writing about Jesus, and he's writing about some of Isaiah's prophecies, and some of Isaiah's prophecies said that Jesus wouldn't be accepted. And John says that, despite all the miraculous works that Jesus did, the people didn't believe him. And then he says this in John chapter 12, he said, and Isaiah said these things because he saw his glory and spoke of him. So many people think this is who Isaiah is seeing. He sees Jesus on his throne. Okay, and there's three particular details about this, right? First is he's on his throne, he's reigning. So he's seeing the Lord in all his glory. And again, maybe this Christophany of Jesus, of Jesus on his throne, reigning. Not only that, he's high and lifted up. He's exalted. So he's reigning in glory, right? In fact, it says the train of his robe filled the temple, which is interesting because the temple, again, the people at this time would say, well, God's presence was in this Holy of Holies, in this room. But here it's saying, no, it's filling the temple, this place of worship. It fills our worship. And then he continues with this vision. Verse 2, he says, and above him stood seraphim. Each had 6 wings. With 2, he covered his face. With 2, he covered his feet. And with 2, he flew. So around the Lord, there are these creatures, seraphims. Now, a seraph is basically, literally, a burning one is what it means. Or to burn. So these are burning ones, which could be referring to their zeal for the Lord, or it could be referring to something else that we're going to look at in just a moment. But anyway, so you have these burning ones, right? And they're flying around. They have 6 wings. It says 2, they covered their face, which is a sign of humility. 2, they covered their feet, which is a sign of servanthood. They're saying, all right, everything that we do, everywhere we walk is for him. So they cover that. And then it says with 2, they flew, which is talking about their worship, that they're flying around the Lord. And he goes on and says, well, what were they doing? Verse 3, and one called to another and said, holy, holy, holy is the Lord of hosts. The whole earth is full of his glory. And the foundation of the threshold shook at the voice of him who called, and the house was filled with smoke. He's talking about the Lord here who had called him, that he's going to talk about in just a moment, in verse 8, where it says, who shall go for us? But he's saying, all right, so these seraphims are talking, right? And they're saying, holy, holy, holy. And in the Old Testament, when they put 3 words together, again, things that are repeated are important. So here, 3, when you repeated something in 3, it kind of symbolizes completion or perfection. So what they're saying is the Lord here is perfectly holy, completely holy, utterly holy. In fact, they say the entire earth, not just the temple now, is filled with his glory. He's everywhere. And when he speaks, his voice shakes the thresholds and the foundation. These are huge and what he's talking about is in the temple they had these huge foundation stones that were too big for anybody to be able to move, but at his mere voice they shake. Talking about the power of God. And it says, the whole house is filled with smoke. And this smoke could represent when God guided his people Israel into the promised land. Remember, he came to them in smoke, in a cloud of smoke during the day. So it represents God's presence. So when he was present, the smoke filled the temple, or everybody knew his presence was among his people. So here, in the beginning of this vision, right, in Isaiah's defining moment begins to unfold, we discover that being shaped for selfless sacrifice that makes all the difference even in our world, it begins with, first of all, clearly seeing God. It begins with us seeing God clearly for who He is, for all that He is. Isaiah sees God for who He is, right? The one who reigns on high, the one who is worthy of worship. He is the one who is perfect, flawless, all-powerful, and the center of all things. This is kind of what Paul was talking about in Colossians chapter 1 when he's describing Jesus to the people he's writing to. He says, "For by Him all things were created in heaven and earth, visible and invisible, whether thrones or dominions or rulers or authorities. All things were created through Him and for Him." And then a couple verses later he says, "So that in everything He may have preeminence." He may be first place in everything. Nothing compares with God. And by seeing God in all His glory, we find the one who is the source, who is the ruler of all, who is the powerful one, who alone is worthy of worship. God is so much greater than anything or everything. He inspires all, or He is awesome, right? Do you know God is bigger and He is better than anything that we may face in our world today, bigger than any opposition we may face, bigger than anybody else's promises to us of something great. He's bigger than any challenge that may come our way. God's glory overwhelms any darkness that may come our way in our world today. And in seeing God's glory, everything else pales in comparison. Everything else just melts away. So it should be no surprise to us that after Isaiah sees this clearly, he responds to it. Look at the next verse, verse 5. So he says, "I've just seen the Lord. And I said," as a response, "Woe is me! For I am lost. I'm a man of unclean lips. I dwell in the midst of a people of unclean lips. For my eyes have seen the Lord. The Lord has seen the King, the Lord of hosts." He basically says, compared to God, I'm doomed. I'm nothing. I have no chance. Woe is me. That's basically what he's saying. And this is pretty significant for Isaiah. It's a huge change, actually, for Isaiah. You see, because when we start to look back at what Isaiah was just talking about before he had this vision, and we look back at chapter 5, and you can look back on your own later on today, beginning in verse 8, he talks about woes. But he's pronouncing woes upon the people, upon other people. And he's saying, "Woe to you, Judah, you sinners. Woe to you who call evil good and good evil. Woe to you who are wise in your own eyes." And he starts saying all these woes about other people, about the people that have sinned against God. So he's, woe to all you people. But then something happens. He sees God. He sees God clearly, himself. And he begins to see that woe for others also includes himself. See, he doesn't measure up. He also isn't worthy. You see, being shaped for selfless sacrifice is not only about seeing God clearly, but also about seeing ourselves honestly. Isaiah realized that he himself had no business in the presence of a holy God. You see, sometimes we can think of ourselves and we can say, well, I'm better than most people. But you know what? Being not as bad as someone else is still bad. One sin, any sin, stains us. No amount of good can ever make us worthy of God's acceptance, of God's glory. And Isaiah comes to this realization. In fact, this moment probably echoes through his entire ministry, because later on in Isaiah, he kind of echoes this statement. In Isaiah 64, he says, you know what? We have all become like one who's unclean. All our righteous deeds, all our attempts to be right with God are like a polluted garment, like a filthy rag. We all fade like a leaf, and our iniquity, like the wind, take us away. We're nothing. And that's what Isaiah says. He starts to see himself honestly, and in response to seeing himself honestly, he cries out, right? He says, I'm a man of unclean lips. Now this is referring not only to his words that are unclean, but also his actions that also speak for his attempts to be righteous. And he says, I'm a man of unclean lips, and I live among a people of unclean lips. Or, I'm no better or more worthy than anybody else. I'm doomed. When we see God clearly in all his glory, it makes us view ourselves honestly. We will never see ourselves honestly until we see God clearly. These two are tied together, right? God is the standard, and we cannot and we do not measure up. Now, in light of this, we can either shrivel up or give up and say, oh, well, I'm done. Or we can cry out for rescue. And this is what Isaiah does. And he says, whoa, it's me. And he says, I'm a man of unclean lips. Or, I can't do this. And he cries out for rescue. And what happens next changes everything. Look at verse 6. As Isaiah recounts what happens to him, he says, then one of the seraphim flew to me, having in his hand a burning coal that he had taken with tongs from the altar. And he touched my mouth and said, behold, this has touched your lips. Your guilt is taken away and your sin atoned for. This seraphim, right, this burning one. Well, then he comes and he brings a burning coal from the altar. You see, this seraphim, this burning one, is also a purifying one. Fire purified. And he comes and he takes a burning coal from the altar. What altar is he talking about here? Well, he's talking about this altar that was always burning in the midst of the temple. It was an altar where people would give burnt sacrifices for the atonement or forgiveness of their sins. And this altar, we're told, is always burning. It's constantly burning because people are constantly bringing sacrifices for their sin, because their sin is constantly happening. So this altar is always burning. And so it was taken from this forgiveness that this altar represents, was then taken, and it was brought to Isaiah. Right? And he was made clean. Actually, it says it touched his lips, or applies the sacrifice to Isaiah. And as a result, it says his guilt is taken away and his sins are atoned for, paid for. Basically, you know what it is? His sin and his shame are gone. Do you see the picture here? Do you see this picture? Isaiah sees the Lord. Possibly and probably Jesus, seated on the throne in all of his glory. And he says, I'm undone. Help me. Okay? He cries out in desperation. And one is sent to the altar to bring the sacrifice to Isaiah, applying it to him so he can have his guilt taken away and his sin paid for, so that he can be forgiven and made clean or acceptable to God. What an amazing picture of Jesus, isn't it? This is what Jesus did. He was our burnt offering, our sacrifice given for us for the atonement of sin. And he came to us just as this was brought to Isaiah. And in this picture, we find that being shaped for selfless sacrifice involves seeing God clearly and as perfect and holy, which then leads to us seeing ourselves honestly, or as one who's unworthy, yet is made clean and acceptable, not by any work of our own, but by being changed by God. Being holy and acceptable by a holy and perfect God is only possible by the work, power, the grace and mercy of that same God. It's God through Jesus who comes to us, who sacrifices himself on our behalf, so that when we cry out for rescue, when we cry out for salvation, he purifies us or cleanses us, making us worthy, making us his. This picture is what Paul is painting in Ephesians chapter 2, with a passage we're probably all familiar with, when he says, "For by grace you've been saved through faith. This is not your own doing. It's a gift from God. It's not a result of our works, so that nobody can boast in it." Not even Isaiah. Isaiah's not sitting there saying, "I'm better than you." He's saying, "Whoa, wow. This isn't about me, but about him." It's a gift. And this is God's work in and for us, so that we can in turn offer ourselves fully to him. In fact, that's what Paul says in the next verse, isn't it? "For we're his workmanship, created in Christ Jesus for good works, that God be prepared beforehand that we should walk in him." So who will go for us? Whom shall I send? Who will go for us? Here am I. Send me. Selfless servanthood. This is selfless servanthood. And this is only possible when we see God clearly, when we see ourselves honestly, and when we're changed by God. It's then we can offer ourselves to God. We can say, "Here am I. Send me." We can follow wherever he leads. We can do whatever he asks, because it's he who will work in and through us. Just as he has already done, he will continue to do. In this, we can offer ourselves up to God. We can offer ourselves up to God right in our world. When we go to work, we can offer ourselves up to God and say, "God, use me. This isn't about me. Use me, lead me, do whatever you need to do with my work with me." He can use us at home with our family, or at school, or with our friends, or even here at church. And we can say, "All right, God, you know what? Use me any way you want to. Wherever you want to, however you want to." As we trust God to use us in sharing Jesus, the one who has changed us. Now, before we close, I want to offer one caveat to all this, because it sounds great. But here's one caveat. Selfless servanthood isn't always easy. In fact, right after Isaiah makes this great call and he says, "Here am I, send me," and he's pumped up and he says, "Yes, God, whatever." And as you go home today, I want you to read the verses that follow, because I'll give you a synopsis of what God says to Isaiah after he says, "Here am I, send me, I'll go and I'll do anything and I'll go anywhere for you." And God says, "Good, you're going to share, and you're going to share your words, but nobody's going to listen. You're going to try to change people's attitudes, and they're not going to change." And Isaiah cries out to God, "What are you talking about? Well, how long? How long am I going to need to do this before I start seeing some results?" And God goes on to tell him, "You're going to continue to do this until these prophecies are fulfilled. Until this judgment comes, and then until Jesus is seen. All these prophecies of Jesus come to fruition. Now, if you think about that, again, this is hundreds of years before Jesus came. So Isaiah would never see these with his own eyes. He would never partake fully in what God, in how God used him, yet he still served. And he still said, all right, God, I'll do whatever you want, however you want. So he shared. And the amazing thing about Isaiah, again, more than any other Old Testament writer, Isaiah paints a picture of who Jesus is, what Jesus has done for us, who he will be in all of his glory. That came to fruition hundreds of years after Isaiah and changed so much more than Isaiah could even realize. It didn't just change his people, Judah, it changed the world. As Isaiah came in selfless servanthood. So these words would one day come to pass. His selfless service to God would bear fruit well beyond his life. You see, when we offer ourselves up to God in selfless servanthood, we may never see the kind of results that we may hope for. We might not see those kind of results that we hope for. But we also may never fully grasp the impact our lives may have well beyond us. See, that's God's work, not ours. So, you want to make the most of the year ahead and beyond? Then bring into it two attitudes. One we talked about last week, unshakable faith. That just stands firm in God and influences others, right? But also brings selfless servanthood. These two attitudes will make all the difference in our world. As God leads us, as he shapes us, as he uses us to share Jesus to a world that desperately, desperately needs him. To those around us who need him. And we can bring this attitude so that God can use us this year. Let's pray.